Everyone mocked Daniel's dead island until his system made it profitable overnight. One blueprint produced fresh water, luxury salt, and an empire's foundation. Daniel Haye arrived alone on a lifeless basalt spike. No food, tools, allies, soil, or escape waited there. His system accelerated any precise design backed by real knowledge. Daniel still had to build everything with his own hands. By sunrise, sweet water and moon salt covered the dead rock. That first harvest was valuable enough to purchase a boat. Daniel was only a landscape architect beneath an alien sky. His ordinary profession had become this world's strongest survival advantage. 3 days earlier, cold seawater struck his face and dragged him awake. At the same time, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. Gray ocean surrounded him in every direction, empty enough to feel unreal. More importantly, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. A black basalt spire rose through the fog like a broken needle beneath the surface. Practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. There was no grass, no tree, and no visible sign of life. Still, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. A soaked parchment clung to Daniel's right hand. In that moment, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. The writing looked completely foreign, yet every word entered his mind clearly. In practice, Bone Needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. It was a legal deed naming him owner of the island. On Bone Needle, professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. Daniel read it twice before accepting how terrible the property looked. For Daniel, survival had to come before comfort or pride. After 10 years designing landscapes, he had evaluated many damaged sites. Even then, the system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. Bone Needle was easily the worst assignment he had ever received. Throughout that period, each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. The fog erased every landmark, leaving Daniel no clue which direction promised rescue. For Daniel, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. Even the deed offered no explanation for how he reached this world. Even then, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. His clothes remained soaked, and the wind kept draining body heat throughout that period. Practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. Still, professional curiosity prevented fear from becoming complete paralysis. At the same time, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. Daniel inspected the shoreline before wasting strength on random movement. More importantly, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. No footprints, tools, ruins, or smoke suggested another resident nearby. Beneath the surface, Bone Needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. The island's silence made ownership feel more like a sentence than a reward. Still, professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. Yet Daniel had repaired places other experts considered permanently ruined. In that moment, survival had to come before comfort or pride. Still, complaining would not create shelter, water, or food. In practice, the system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. He wrung out his jacket and pushed through the freezing shallows. On Bone Needle, each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. Every step sank between loose stones hidden beneath the surface. In that moment, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. When he finally reached land, the basalt felt unusually warm. In practice, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. Its porous texture immediately triggered the professional part of his brain. On Bone Needle, practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. Broken basalt could support plants if mixed with enough organic material. For Daniel, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. A protected slope, proper drainage, and patient soil building might create grass. Even then, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. Daniel was already studying elevation when a vibration rang through his skull. Throughout that period, Bone Needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. The sensation felt like a tuning fork striking inside his head. At the same time, professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. A system notification confirmed that the island's owner had been registered. More importantly, survival had to come before comfort or pride. Then it requested a concept capable of guiding future development. Beneath the surface, the system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. Daniel sat on the stone and studied his scarred, calloused hands. Still, each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. Those were not the hands of a chosen hero or trained fighter. More importantly, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. They belonged to a man who had spent a decade repairing ruined land. Beneath the surface, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. Instead of panicking, Daniel spoke to Bone Needle like another difficult project. Still, practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. He asked the island to show him its condition and hidden potential. In that moment, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. The basalt trembled faintly beneath his palm. In practice, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. That tiny response told Daniel something impossible was listening. By then, Bone Needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. Night arrived before he could discover anything more useful for Daniel. Professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. He crawled beneath an overhanging rock and made it his first shelter. Even then, survival had to come before comfort or pride. There was no food, fire, communication, or human voice anywhere nearby. Throughout that period, the system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. Alien stars appeared overhead without one constellation Daniel recognized. At the same time, each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. That sight confirmed he had not simply washed onto an unknown coast. Even then, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. He was stranded in another world with nothing but his training. Throughout that period, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. Fear finally reached him once darkness removed every practical distraction. At the same time, practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. However, the stone beneath his exhausted body remained strangely warm. More importantly, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. Bone Needle protected him from the cold during that first night. Beneath the surface, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. At dawn, Daniel followed moisture toward a crack on the eastern slope. Still, Bone Needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. Mineral-heavy salt water seeped from the stone in a weak but steady flow. In that moment, professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. It was undrinkable, yet water meant the island possessed usable circulation. In practice, survival had to come before comfort or pride. The request for a concept meant the system expected more than simple survival. On Bone Needle, the system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. Daniel suspected the island needed direction before revealing its true functions. For Daniel, each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. He had built parks on landfills and gardens beside abandoned mines. In practice, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. Those projects taught him that dead-looking ground often concealed recoverable systems. On Bone Needle, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. Bone Needle might be harsher, but the underlying principle remained familiar. For Daniel, practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. Instead of asking for instant shelter, Daniel first searched for water. Even then, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. That decision revealed the discipline separating him from ordinary stranded survivors. Throughout that period, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. Comfort could wait, but dehydration could end everything within days. At the same time, Bone Needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. Daniel spent hours studying sunlight, wind, temperature, and natural elevation. More importantly, professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. Then he scratched a cascading desalination design directly onto a basalt slab. Beneath the surface, survival had to come before comfort or pride. The design used 8 shallow basins arranged across 3 descending levels. Still, the system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. Sunlight would heat the upper water and drive controlled evaporation. In that moment, each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. Cooler stone surfaces would collect vapor and guide condensation downward. Beneath the surface, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. A final basin would store the resulting fresh water. Still, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. Daniel specified every angle, material, airflow direction, and expected output allowed. In that moment, practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. The southern slope needed exactly 3 degrees for reliable movement. In practice, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. Walls required porous stone that could cool quickly after sunset. On Bone Needle, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. The final system should produce roughly 2 liters of water daily. For Daniel, Bone Needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. When Daniel completed the specification, the scratch lines deepened by themselves. Even then, professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. Every mark became sharper, cleaner, and more precise than his stone tool allowed. Throughout that period, survival had to come before comfort or pride. The system had accepted his concept because the design was technically sound. At the same time, The system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. It did not summon a finished machine or move every rock automatically. More importantly, each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. Daniel still had to carry, place, test, and rebuild each component. Throughout that period, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. However, stone settled together as though invisible grooves guided his hands. At the same time, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. By evening, a rough but functional cascade crossed the eastern slope. More importantly, practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. Exhaustion dropped Daniel beside the lowest basin before he could celebrate. Beneath the surface, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. Morning revealed the first undeniable miracle. Still, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. Silvery green moss-covered surfaces that had been bare the night before. In that moment, bone needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. The growth expanded condensation area and improved the original design automatically. In practice, professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. Clear water waited inside the lower basin. On bone needle, survival had to come before comfort or pride. Daniel scooped one handful and expected a faint salty taste. For Daniel, the system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. Instead, the water tasted sweet and cold like a mountain spring. Even then, each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. He drank until his shaking body finally relaxed. On bone needle, the empty horizon offered no immediate rescue. Then sunlight flashed across crystals inside the upper basin. For Daniel, every early choice carried consequences Daniel could not reverse. Coarse blue-white salt had formed as a byproduct of desalination. Even then, practical thinking remained his only defense against panic. Daniel tasted one crystal and immediately recognized exceptional purity. Throughout that period, the unfamiliar sky confirmed he was impossibly far from home. The system had not merely accelerated his design. At the same time, his soaked body continued losing strength to the cold. It had optimized the design according to the island's hidden ecological memory. More importantly, bone needle allowed no margin for careless mistakes. Daniel checked each basin twice because one bad angle could waste the entire flow. Beneath the surface, professional instinct kept Daniel moving when fear could not. The first attempt leaked through a joint near the second level. Still, survival had to come before comfort or pride. He dismantled that section and rebuilt it before darkness arrived. In that moment, the system rewarded knowledge instead of desperate wishes. Correcting mistakes immediately taught the system what Daniel considered acceptable in practice. Each correct measurement made the dead rock more responsive. The finished cascade looked crude, yet every component served a measurable purpose. Still, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. Daniel had no container, so the lowest basin doubled as storage. In that moment, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. He slept beside the design because protecting it mattered more than comfort. In practice, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. By morning, the island had transformed rough engineering into living infrastructure. On bone needle, the first green growth changed how visitors understood bone needle. Weeks of moss growth had happened during a single night. For Daniel, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. Natural processes still followed rules, but time no longer limited them normally. Even then, Wren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. That realization transformed Daniel's situation from hopeless to dangerous. Throughout that period, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. Knowledge could make bone needle produce resources nobody expected. At the same time, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. During the next week, Daniel constructed 2 additional cascades. More importantly, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. Daily fresh water output climbed to roughly 10 liters beneath the surface. Preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. Moon salt accumulated beside the upper basins in valuable blue-white piles. At the same time, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. He also designed a safe path between his shelter and the water system. More importantly, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. Each spoke in turn caused cracks to close and loose surfaces to settle. Beneath the surface, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. The island rewarded specifications, not vague wishes. Still, the first green growth changed how visitors understood bone needle. Daniel could not simply demand wealth, comfort, or protection. In that moment, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. He needed to understand a problem and present a real solution. In practice, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. That limitation made the power feel less like magic and more like partnership. On Bone Needle, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. On the 8th day, thick fog swallowed the surrounding ocean. For Daniel, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. Daniel heard wood creaking and oars striking water beyond the shoreline. Even then, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. A damaged schooner slowly appeared through the white curtain. Throughout that period, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. Its captain reached Bone Needle looking exhausted, desperate, and dehydrated. For Daniel, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. Two crew members were sick, and the ship had completely lost direction. Even then, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. The visitors needed water more than money or information. Throughout that period, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. Daniel possessed enough for himself, but barely enough for 6 strangers. At the same time, the first green growth changed how visitors understood Bone Needle. One part of him wanted to protect every drop he had created. More importantly, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. Another part saw living people whose condition could become fatal by morning. Beneath the surface, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. Daniel chose the second voice and opened access to the cascade. Still, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. Captain Ren drank directly from his hands until his breathing steadied. In that moment, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. Then he stared at the clear basin with complete disbelief. In practice, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. Bone Needle had been famous as a dead rock without usable water. On Bone Needle, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. Daniel explained that he had built a desalination system. In that moment, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. Ren inspected the cascade, moss, and blue-white crystals carefully. In practice, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. The moment he tasted the salt, his entire expression changed. On Bone Needle, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. He identified it as moon salt, a luxury resource found on one distant island. For Daniel, the first green growth changed how visitors understood Bone Needle. Ren's crew watched Daniel like they had found a wizard pretending to be ordinary. Even then, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. Daniel refused to explain powers he barely understood himself. Throughout that period, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. Instead, he demonstrated the practical route from saltwater to safe drinking water. At the same time, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. That explanation impressed Ren more than a mysterious magical claim would have. More importantly, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. A repeatable process meant future production rather than one lucky miracle. Beneath the surface, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. Ren also noticed Daniel shared water before asking what payment they carried. Still, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. That choice established trust before any formal partnership existed. More importantly, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. Bone Needle's first outside relationship began with rescue instead of negotiation. Beneath the surface, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. A single handful could earn a silver coin in the nearest port. Still, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. The pile beside Daniel's cascade was valuable enough to purchase a boat. In that moment, the first green growth changed how visitors understood Bone Needle. That was the first major proof that Bone Needle could generate real wealth. In practice, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. Yesterday, Daniel had been homeless on an unwanted rock. On Bone Needle, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. Today, he was homeless beside a profitable waterworks. In practice, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. Instead of asking Ren for money, Daniel asked where he could buy seeds. Even then, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. That question showed exactly what kind of empire Daniel intended to build. Throughout that period, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. He did not want a treasure pile surrounded by starvation. At the same time, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. He wanted living soil, food security, and a settlement capable of lasting. Even then, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. Ren promised to return with supplies and trade the moon salt. Throughout that period, Every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. When the schooner disappeared, silence settled over Bone Needle again. At the same time, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. Daniel counted everything he owned before beginning the next stage. More importantly, the first green growth changed how visitors understood Bone Needle. He had a sack of grain, rope, fire, water, and growing salt reserves beneath the surface. Renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. The list remained small, but it was infinitely better than nothing. Still, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. Daniel ate soaked grain while studying the sheltered southern slope. In that moment, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. Beneath the thin basalt crust, he sensed weathered material containing ancient organic traces. In practice, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. That location offered the best chance of creating true soil. On Bone Needle, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. Without a shovel, he pried stones loose using wounded fingers. For Daniel, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. His nails cracked, his palms opened, and blood marked the basalt. In practice, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. Daniel wrapped both hands with strips torn from his clothing. On Bone Needle, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. Pain changed nothing because the island could not design itself. For Daniel, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. By noon, he had exposed an area about the size of a dining table. Even then, the first green growth changed how visitors understood Bone Needle. Dark loose material waited beneath the hard volcanic surface. Throughout that period, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. Daniel rubbed it between his fingers, smelled it, and tested its structure. At the same time, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. The layer lacked nitrogen, but its drainage and mineral content were promising. More importantly, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. Seaweed could add nutrients while crushed shells supplied calcium. Beneath the surface, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. Small gravel beneath the bed would prevent roots from drowning. Still, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. He dictated a complete terrace specification directly to the system. In that moment, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. The first plot measured for by 3 meters. Beneath the surface, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. Its fertile layer needed roughly 30 centimeters of engineered soil. Still, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. Daniel calculated the terrace as infrastructure, not merely a patch of dirt. In that moment, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. Every layer needed a purpose because replacement materials did not exist. In practice, the first green growth changed how visitors understood Bone Needle. The retaining wall also trapped warmth after sunset. On Bone Needle, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. That extra heat could protect seedlings during cold coastal nights. For Daniel, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. Seaweed mulch would reduce evaporation and slowly feed the soil. Even then, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. Crushed shells would prevent acidity from becoming another hidden failure. Throughout that period, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. Daniel spoke these details aloud until the system's vibration stabilized. At the same time, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. Only then did he begin the labor capable of making the blueprint real. More importantly, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. A 2-degree southern slope would carry excess moisture away. Throughout that period, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. A half-meter retaining wall would block the strongest ocean wind. At the same time, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. Drip irrigation would connect the terrace to the third cascade. More importantly, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. Once the design was accepted, Daniel began 3 days of brutal labor. Beneath the surface, the first green growth changed how visitors understood Bone Needle. He hauled seaweed from the shore until his back stopped straightening. Still, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. He smashed shells and basalt into usable grit. In that moment, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. He carried water one painful trip at a time. By that stage, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. The system did not perform those tasks for him. On Bone Needle, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. It only made each correct decision work better than nature normally allowed. For Daniel, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. Shell fragments settled evenly throughout the growing medium. Even then, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. Water found channels slightly faster than Daniel's calculations predicted. On Bone Needle, trade was slowly replacing the island's complete isolation. Small advantages accumulated until the impossible terrace finally existed. For Daniel, every new resource exposed another problem Daniel still needed to solve. Dark, moist soil now rested securely on previously barren rock. Even then, his injured hands paid for every visible improvement. Working drainage protected it from flooding. Throughout that period, the first green growth changed how visitors understood Bone Needle. A low wall guarded it from salt-heavy wind. At the same time, renewable food mattered more than one profitable shipment. Daniel stood over the finished bed with torn hands and exhausted pride. More importantly, Ren's returning schooner connected survival with the wider world. One trained crew could have completed the job much faster. Beneath the surface, Daniel kept choosing long-term stability over immediate comfort. Daniel had only himself, one small shovel-shaped stone, and an island learning his language. Still, merchant interest increased with every successful demonstration. Ren returned on the 16th day carrying the heavy sacks. In that moment, the terrace proved that organized soil could defeat barren stone. Daniel had spent the previous 2 days checking the horizon constantly. In practice, preparation remained essential because the ocean respected nobody. The first sack contained local vegetable seeds. Still, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. One fast-growing green called roachi could be harvested within 3 weeks. In that moment, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. A durable root crop would take longer but store for months. In practice, rumors traveled farther whenever Ren carried moon salt away. The second sack mattered almost as much as food. On Bone Needle, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. It contained a knife, hatchet, short shovel, wire, canvas, and rope. For Daniel, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. Daniel held the real shovel like someone receiving a legendary weapon. Even then, every useful improvement created another responsibility. Ren laughed until he noticed the completed terrace. Throughout that period, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. 2 weeks earlier, only bare basalt had occupied that slope. At the same time, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. Now structured soil, irrigation, drainage, and wind protection waited there. More importantly, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. Ren asked how one person had achieved so much. Beneath the surface, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Real tools changed Daniel's pace more dramatically than another system reward. At the same time, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. The shovel protected his damaged fingers from direct contact with basalt. More importantly, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. The hatchet allowed him to process driftwood and stubborn roots. Beneath the surface, rumors traveled farther whenever Ren carried moon salt away. Canvas improved shelter, while wire created possibilities for future structures. Still, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. Ren's supplies proved trade could multiply Daniel's knowledge efficiently. In that moment, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. Seeds also carried risk because Daniel knew nothing about local varieties. In practice, every useful improvement created another responsibility. He compensated through observation, spacing, drainage, and conservative watering. On Bone Needle, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. Professional fundamentals became his protection against unfamiliar biology. For Daniel, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. Daniel answered that he was extremely good at his profession. Even then, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. That statement was true, although it hid the system's role. Throughout that period, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Daniel planted every seed at deliberate depth and spacing. For Daniel, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. He mulched the surface with chopped seaweed to preserve moisture. Even then, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. Ren claimed roachi could grow almost anywhere. Throughout that period, rumors traveled farther whenever Ren carried moon salt away. Daniel still treated each row like part of an important palace. At the same time, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. Careful work remained careful work regardless of scale. More importantly, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. Watching Daniel changed Ren's interest from charity into business. Beneath the surface, every useful improvement created another responsibility. Wren revealed that his brother-in-law traded rare and expensive seeds. Still, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. If the moon's salt proved consistent, better supplies could follow. In that moment, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. The partnership remained informal, but both men recognized its potential. In practice, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. Wren left with another salt shipment and a bag of hearty sea onions. On Bone Needle, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Daniel returned to solitude with more work than loneliness. In that moment, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. He had crops to monitor, water channels to maintain, and future terraces to plan. In practice, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. Every evening, he climbed the central height and mapped Bone Needle mentally. On Bone Needle, rumors traveled farther whenever Wren carried moon salt away. The system began revealing layers of moisture, temperature, and ecological potential. In practice, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. Warm zones appeared inside his awareness like colors on an architectural plan. Even then, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. Daniel saw places where fog lingered and wind weakened naturally. Throughout that period, every useful improvement created another responsibility. The island was not truly dead. At the same time, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. Life had been sleeping beneath conditions nobody had tried to understand. More importantly, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. On the 5th day after planning, green points broke through the terrace. Beneath the surface, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. Daniel dropped beside them and watched tiny roachi sprouts unfold. Still, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. That fragile color felt more valuable than the entire salt pile. More importantly, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. Then he noticed green threads emerging outside the prepared soil. Beneath the surface, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. Ordinary moss was spreading through cracks around the terrace. Still, rumors traveled farther whenever Wren carried moon salt away. The healthy plot had become a center attracting more life. In that moment, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. Daniel recognized the principle from damaged landscapes in his old world. In practice, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. One successful ecosystem could radiate recovery into surrounding ground. On Bone Needle, every useful improvement created another responsibility. Life wanted to survive if someone created a safe beginning. For Daniel, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. He immediately planned a second terrace rather than protecting only one garden. Even then, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. The first harvest did more than satisfy hunger. Throughout that period, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. It proved the island could support renewable resources instead of temporary scavenging. At the same time, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Daniel saved part of the crop rather than eating everything immediately. Even then, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. Future planning mattered more than one comfortable meal. Throughout that period, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. New moss extended beyond his prepared boundaries without direct system commands. At the same time, rumors traveled farther whenever Wren carried moon salt away. That spontaneous expansion suggested Bone Needle was beginning to maintain itself. More importantly, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. Daniel documented every change mentally before planning another construction. Beneath the surface, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. Growth without understanding could become dangerous as quickly as it became profitable. Still, every useful improvement created another responsibility. 3 weeks after planning, Daniel harvested his first roachi leaves. In that moment, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. They tasted bitter, slightly nutty, and absolutely incredible. In practice, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. Every bite represented food grown on stone through knowledge and endurance. On Bone Needle, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. Moss now covered several square meters beyond the cultivated bed. For Daniel, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Small, unfamiliar plants appeared without Daniel planning them. In practice, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. Birds began circling closer to the freshwater cascades. On Bone Needle, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. Bone Needle was changing slowly enough to study, but quickly enough to inspire fear. For Daniel, Rumors traveled farther whenever Ren carried moon salt away. Ren returned 1 month after his first visit with another schooner. Even then, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. Captain Dora stepped ashore carrying the confidence of a veteran sailor. Throughout that period, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. She tasted the water, tested the salt, and inspected the green terrace. At the same time, every useful improvement created another responsibility. Her disbelief disappeared after seeing every system operate. More importantly, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. Dora had brought pickaxes, a crowbar, a saw, boards, nails, and compost. Beneath the surface, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. Daniel hugged the compost bag with more emotion than any merchant expected. Still, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. Organic matter meant microorganisms, and microorganisms meant stable soil. In that moment, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Stable soil meant plants, food, people, and eventually permanent civilization. Beneath the surface, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. Ren stayed that night beside Daniel's first properly designed campfire. Still, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. He shared rumors about growing tension among surrounding empires. In that moment, rumors traveled farther whenever Ren carried moon salt away. Volcania was constructing warships while Lumira closed southern ports. At that stage, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. The Black Tide pirates had also increased attacks across neutral waters. On Bone Needle, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. Bone Needle belonged to no empire because nobody valued a dead rock. For Daniel, every useful improvement created another responsibility. Clean water and moon salt had already begun changing that protection. Even then, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. Daniel listened while root vegetables grew quietly inside his first terrace. Throughout that period, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. Foreign wars sounded distant, but the island's value made distance temporary. At the same time, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. Before politics arrived, Daniel needed stronger infrastructure and more food. More importantly, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Ren's political warning introduced threats Daniel could not solve with irrigation alone. Throughout that period, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. For empires would view neutral wealth as an invitation rather than private property. At the same time, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. Daniel lacked citizenship, military backing, and recognized allies. More importantly, rumors traveled farther whenever Ren carried moon salt away. His deed might prove ownership without guaranteeing anyone respected it. Beneath the surface, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. That vulnerability made every independent food source strategically important. Still, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. Storm preparation also became necessary before human enemies even arrived. In that moment, every useful improvement created another responsibility. Daniel checked the eastern shore after noticing waves growing unusually high. In practice, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. The ocean delivered its first major attack before any empire could act. On Bone Needle, the approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. The 40th night brought a storm powerful enough to test everything. By then, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. Wind hammered the eastern shore while waves shook the entire basalt formation. Even then, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Daniel woke beneath his rock shelter and immediately thought about the Cascades. By then, Bone Needle was becoming valuable faster than Daniel could defend it. If seawater flooded the basins, weeks of survival work would disappear. For Daniel, each harvest reduced dependence on uncertain visiting ships. He crawled through horizontal rain because standing became impossible. Even then, rumors traveled farther whenever Ren carried moon salt away. Waves had already reached the lower collection basin. Throughout that period, Daniel's plans were expanding beyond one person's survival. Another half-meter would destroy the entire system. At the same time, the growing ecosystem attracted both life and unwanted attention. Daniel started stacking stones into a retaining wall with bleeding hands. More importantly, every useful improvement created another responsibility. The storm tore loose every piece he placed too slowly. Beneath the surface, political danger remained distant, but no longer irrelevant. Salt water flooded part of the lower cascade and cracked its edge still. The approaching storm would test more than ordinary construction. That damage ignited anger stronger than Daniel's exhaustion. In that moment, Daniel still lacked the workforce his ambitions required. He pressed both palms against the warm basalt and addressed Bone Needle directly. In practice, nature was about to challenge every shortcut he had avoided. Daniel shouted the breakwater specifications into wind powerful enough to steal his breath still. The storm punished every weakness without mercy. The barrier needed a semicircular shape protecting both the cascade and eastern spring. In that moment, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. Its foundation required 1.5 meters of width. In practice, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. The upper edge could narrow to 0.5 meter. On Bone Needle, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. A 1-meter height would block the largest incoming surge for Daniel. Every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. The outer slope needed 15 degrees to redirect wave force sideways. Even then, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. Drainage channels at the base would release trapped water instead of increasing pressure. Throughout that period, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. Daniel described local basalt, joint placement, curve radius, and final alignment. At the same time, stopping would return the island to complete dependence. The system vibration returned immediately beneath his hands. More importantly, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. Nearby stones became warm and strangely cooperative. Beneath the surface, that brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. They did not fly into position or build themselves. At the same time, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. Daniel still lifted every piece while rain blinded him. More importantly, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. However, each stone felt lighter when placed correctly. Beneath the surface, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. Wrong placements resisted like Bone Needle was rejecting bad design. Still, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. Correct placements locked together with almost no wasted motion. In that moment, every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. Daniel dragged the first foundation stones across flooded ground. In practice, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. A wave struck his knees and threw him sideways. By then, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. He caught a sharp edge before the ocean pulled him away. For Daniel, stopping would return the island to complete dependence. Blood washed from his palms into black water. Even then, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. Daniel climbed back and replaced the stone he had dropped. Throughout that period, that brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. Another wave filled the lower basin with seawater. For Daniel, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. He emptied it using his hands in a broken container. Even then, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. The system could accelerate nature, but it could not protect careless timing. Throughout that period, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. Daniel changed the construction order to stabilize the northern section first. At the same time, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. That section received the strongest direct impact. More importantly, every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. Once anchored, it could shelter the remaining curve. Beneath the surface, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. He wedged broad stones below smaller interlocking pieces. Still, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. Every spoken measurement helped the basalt settle tighter. In that moment, stopping would return the island to complete dependence. Wind screamed across the unfinished barrier. In practice, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. The storm reduced his world to stone, water, pain, and calculation. On Bone Needle, that brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. Daniel stopped thinking about empires, money, or future crops. In that moment, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. Only the cascade mattered because fresh water meant survival. In practice, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. Only the wall mattered because survival needed protection. On Bone Needle, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. Hours passed without any visible change in the darkness. For Daniel, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. His arms weakened until lifting became nearly impossible. Even then, every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. Daniel began rolling stones instead of carrying them. Throughout that period, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. He used body weight, leverage, and the slope itself. At the same time, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. Landscape architecture had never felt this close to combat. More importantly, Stopping would return the island to complete dependence. The opponent was not a villain with a sword. Beneath the surface, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. It was an ocean capable of erasing weeks of labor. Still, that brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. Daniel refused to let the sea decide his future. More importantly, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. He adjusted the curve after noticing water striking too directly beneath the surface. Correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. The new angle split each surge into two weaker streams. Still, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. That small correction prevented the center from collapsing. In that moment, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. Bone Needle warmed beneath him whenever the geometry improved. In practice, every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. The island was learning from Daniel while Daniel learned from the storm. On Bone Needle, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. A section near the southern edge began shifting under repeated waves for Daniel. Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. Daniel dismantled it before failure spread through the entire barrier. Even then, stopping would return the island to complete dependence. Starting over cost precious time, but ignoring the flaw cost everything. Throughout that period, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. He rebuilt the foundation deeper and increased the outer slope at the same time. That brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. This time, the stones settled with complete stability. Even then, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. Daniel used broken skin, torn clothing, and the last of his strength. Throughout that period, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. The eastern sky remained black, offering no clue when dawn would arrive. At the same time, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. Rainwater filled his eyes and made every surface dangerous. More importantly, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. Several times, Daniel nearly lost consciousness against the warm basalt beneath the surface. Every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. Each time, another wave reminded him why stopping was impossible. Still, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. The cascade behind him continued overflowing with contaminated water. In that moment, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. Its channels groaned but remained connected. In practice, stopping would return the island to complete dependence. The wall reached his knees near the middle of the night. On Bone Needle, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. By then, it already reduced the force reaching the lower basin for Daniel. That brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. That partial success gave Daniel enough hope to continue. In practice, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. He extended the curve toward the southern anchor point. On Bone Needle, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. Stones that once required both arms now shifted under careful leverage. At that point, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. The system was not making Daniel stronger. Even then, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. It was making correct construction more efficient. Throughout that period, every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. That difference prevented the ability from becoming effortless cheating. At the same time, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. Every gain still depended on knowledge and deliberate action. More importantly, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. Daniel had to earn the island's response repeatedly. Beneath the surface, stopping would return the island to complete dependence. A vague command for protection would have produced nothing. Still, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. Specific dimensions gave Bone Needle something real to become. In that moment, that brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. The wall reached Daniel's waist as the wind changed direction. Beneath the surface, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. A stronger surge approached from the northeast. Still, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. Daniel heard it before seeing the towering black shape. In that moment, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. The wave struck the unfinished center with enough force to shake the shore. In practice, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. For one terrifying second, the entire barrier flexed. On Bone Needle, every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. Several upper stones broke loose and vanished into the water. For Daniel, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. The foundation remained exactly where Daniel had placed it. Even then, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. His calculation had survived the storm's hardest test. Throughout that period, Stopping would return the island to complete dependence. Daniel laughed once, breathless and almost angry. At the same time, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. Then he replaced the missing stones before the next wave arrived. More importantly, that brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. The curved face now redirected water away from the cascades. Throughout that period, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. Each successful impact confirmed the design worked. At the same time, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. The upper basin stopped flooding as often. More importantly, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. Fresh water still could not be used, but the system remained alive. Beneath the surface, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. Daniel completed the southern connection shortly before dawn. Still, every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. Only the top row remained unfinished. In that moment, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. His hands could barely close around another stone. In practice, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. He wrapped his fingers with wet strips of canvas. On Bone Needle, stopping would return the island to complete dependence. No one would know if Daniel disappeared beneath the waves. For Daniel, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. That loneliness could have broken him. Even then, that brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. Instead, it sharpened his refusal to lose. On Bone Needle, the storm punished every weakness without mercy. He placed the final stones according to the original specification. For Daniel, correct geometry mattered more than raw physical strength. The island vibrated from one end of the curve to the other. Even then, Daniel's pain narrowed the world to one necessary decision. Every joint tightened as if sharing the same memory. Throughout that period, fresh water remained useless unless he could protect it. Morning light slowly revealed what Daniel had constructed. At the same time, every stable stone preserved weeks of previous labor. A rough basalt breakwater stood between the ocean and his water system. More importantly, the ocean kept testing whether his calculations were truly correct. Waves crashed against it and rolled backward harmlessly. Beneath the surface, Bone Needle responded only when the design remained precise. The cascades still functioned behind the new barrier. Still, stopping would return the island to complete dependence. Daniel collapsed onto the wet stone and watched the impossible wall hold. In that moment, the unfinished barrier faced another wave before every breath. He had built overnight what a full crew might need a week to complete. In practice, that brutal night transformed engineering into direct survival. The system helped constantly, but his knowledge directed every advantage. Still, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. When the storm weakened near noon, Daniel finally inspected the island. In that moment, the island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. One basin had cracked and several gutters had shifted. In practice, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. Part of the first terrace had been flattened by wind. On Bone Needle, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. The path near the eastern shore was nearly gone. For Daniel, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. His shelter had filled with rain and loose seaweed. Even then, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Nothing looked untouched, yet nothing essential was permanently lost. Throughout that period, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. Daniel could repair damage because the original structures still existed. At the same time, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. He began with the cracked lower basin. More importantly, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. The broken pieces fit together along the old seam. Beneath the surface, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. Daniel pressed them into position and repeated the original measurements. At the same time, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. Something beneath the stone answered more strongly than before. More importantly, the island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. The crack began sealing faster than any natural repair should allow. Beneath the surface, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. It did not vanish, because the damage had genuinely happened. Still, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. Instead, the old seam fused tightly enough to hold water again. In that moment, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. Daniel tested the basin twice before believing the result. In practice, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Next, he returned to the trail erased by the storm. On Bone Needle, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. He restated its width, slope, drainage, and original turns. For Daniel, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. Loose basalt settled into the exact arrangement he remembered. Even then, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. Half a day restored work that originally required 2 full days. Throughout that period, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. That was when Daniel understood the island's deeper function. For Daniel, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. Bone Needle remembered every structure created through an accepted design. Even then, the island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. The longer something remained, the stronger that memory became. Throughout that period, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. Damage could still happen, but restoration now required far less effort. At the same time, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. The system was not only accelerating growth anymore. More importantly, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. It was preserving successful solutions inside the land itself. Beneath the surface, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Daniel named the effect Earth's memory. Still, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. Every terrace, path, wall, and cascade became a permanent pattern. In that moment, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. Destroying one structure would not erase the knowledge behind it. In practice, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. The island could rebuild alongside Daniel faster than enemies could dismantle. On Bone Needle, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. That revelation changed the strategic value of everything he created. In that moment, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. His settlement no longer depended on perfect protection from every disaster. In practice, the island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. It could survive loss because recovery had become its hidden strength. On Bone Needle, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. Daniel tested the ability on another washed-out section. In practice, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. The stones returned 3 times faster than their first installation. Even then, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. Moss reappeared overnight along the restored edge. Throughout that period, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Condensation began flowing before Daniel completed final adjustments. At the same time, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. The repaired breakwater also developed silvery moss across its interface. More importantly, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. That growth captured moisture and redirected it toward the freshwater basin beneath the surface. Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. Bone Needle had optimized the wall beyond Daniel's original purpose. Still, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. Protection had become additional production. More importantly, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. One structure now defended water while creating more of it beneath the surface. The island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. Daniel ran his hand across the warm joints in disbelief. Still, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. The system rewarded designs that cooperated with the island. In that moment, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. Forceful construction worked, but harmonious construction evolved. In practice, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. His battered hands had just unlocked an endlessly compounding advantage. On Bone Needle, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Future storms could damage Bone Needle without resetting its progress. For Daniel, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. Future enemies would face land capable of remembering every defense. Even then, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. Daniel finally looked beyond survival toward permanence. Throughout that period, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. An empire built on ordinary walls could be broken. At the same time, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. An empire remembered by the Earth could always return. Even then, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. The dead rock everyone dismissed had learned how to heal itself. Throughout that period, the island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure, and Daniel had become the only person who understood its language. At the same time, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. Within several days, Daniel restored every structure the storm had damaged. More importantly, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. The breakwater stood tighter than before and produced extra condensation beneath the surface. Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. Moss returned along the terrace edges and spread toward untouched basalt. Still, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Small white flowers with blue centers appeared inside the green carpet. In that moment, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. Daniel had planted none of them. In practice, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. Life was now arriving faster than he could identify it. On Bone Needle, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. On the 48th day, the ocean delivered the island's first permanent companion. For Daniel, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. Daniel heard something heavy striking the eastern rocks repeatedly. In practice, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. He ran toward the sound and found a broken plank trapped between waves. On Bone Needle, the island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. A young woman had tied herself to it with rope. For Daniel, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. One arm hung in seawater, while her face remained against the wood. Even then, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. Daniel pulled the plank closer and dragged her onto the shore. Throughout that period, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. Her pulse was weak but still present. At the same time, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. A broken arrow protruded beneath her left shoulder blade. More importantly, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. Dark discoloration spread from the wound across her ribs. Beneath the surface, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. The injury carried poison, infection, or both. Still, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. Daniel moved her into his sheltered alcove. In that moment, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. Wet clothing was stealing the remaining heat from her body. Beneath the surface, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. He removed it only as necessary and covered her with dry canvas. Still, the island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. Field projects in remote locations had taught Daniel basic emergency care. In that moment, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. He boiled fresh water and sterilized his knife over flame. By then, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. The arrowhead sat several centimeters beneath damaged tissue. At that point, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. Its serrated edges made careless removal extremely dangerous. For Daniel, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Daniel cut carefully around the wound while controlling his breathing. Even then, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. The unconscious woman reacted with a muffled cry but never fully woke. Throughout that period, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. He pulled the arrow free in one smooth movement. At the same time, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. Blackened blood followed the metal onto the canvas. More importantly, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. Daniel rinsed the wound with boiled water. Throughout that period, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. Then he considered the silvery moss growing on the breakwater. At the same time, the island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. That moss purified moisture and thrived within the island's healthiest system. More importantly, damage still mattered, but destruction no longer erased progress. Daniel had no proof it could heal flesh. Beneath the surface, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. He also had no medicine and no time for safer experiments. Still, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. He placed clean moss over the wound and secured it with cloth. In that moment, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Fresh water reached the woman's lips one drop at a time. In practice, the living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. Daniel remained beside her throughout the night. On Bone Needle, that resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. He replaced warm cloths, monitored breathing, and changed the moss repeatedly. At that stage, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. By dawn, the dark line had stopped spreading. Even then, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. Her skin regained color, and her pulse strengthened. On Bone Needle, Earth's memory changed recovery from hope into repeatable advantage. The island's moss had neutralized something Daniel could not understand. For Daniel, The island preserved successful designs beneath every visible structure. When he removed the bandage, the wound had already begun closing. Even then, damage still mattered. But destruction no longer erased progress. Healing that should require days had started within hours. Throughout that period, Daniel was discovering power beyond simple accelerated growth. The woman opened gray eyes near midday. At the same time, Bone Needle had begun defending the work invested in it. Her hand immediately searched for a missing weapon. More importantly, every repaired system returned faster and slightly stronger. Daniel placed her knife within easy reach instead of hiding it beneath the surface. The living landscape was becoming harder to permanently destroy. That gesture proved he wanted cooperation, not control still. That resilience would matter against storms and empires alike. He explained that she was safe on Bone Needle. In that moment, Daniel finally understood why permanence mattered more than perfection. The arrow had been removed, and food and water were available. In practice, the island's hidden memory converted experience into infrastructure. She studied him without blinking before gripping the knife. Still, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. Then exhaustion pulled her back into sleep. In that moment, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. For 3 days, the survivor barely spoke. In practice, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. She drank water, ate roachi, checked her weapon, and slept. Throughout that period, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. Daniel never pressured her for a name or explanation. For Daniel, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. On the 4th day, she stood at the alcove entrance. Even then, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. Her eyes moved across terraces, cascades, paths, and the breakwater. Throughout that period, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. She asked where everyone else was. At the same time, two different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. Daniel answered that he had built everything alone. More importantly, outside rumors kept moving closer, while their trust developed. The woman looked at him as though he had claimed to move mountains. Beneath the surface, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. He admitted that a shovel and several weeks had helped. At the same time, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. She asked to remain until her shoulder recovered. More importantly, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. Daniel told her she could stay as long as needed. Beneath the surface, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. The survivor introduced herself as Minsu-han. Still, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. Minsu did not talk much, but she immediately began contributing. In that moment, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. Daniel returned from work and found construction stones sorted perfectly. In practice, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. Size, shape, and likely use determined every careful pile. On Bone Needle, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. Minsu sharpened her knife nearby without requesting praise. For Daniel, two different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. The next day, 3 clean fish appeared beside the cascade. Even then, outside rumors kept moving closer, while their trust developed. She had caught them barehanded inside tidal pools. Throughout that period, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. Her movements were precise, fast, and completely economical for Daniel. Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. Daniel recognized the discipline of a professional hunter. Even then, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. The fish became his first hot protein-rich meal in weeks. Throughout that period, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. He nearly cried after tasting something beyond grain and greens. At the same time, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. Minsu ate quickly like someone accustomed to losing food. More importantly, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. Without discussion, they developed a practical division of labor. Beneath the surface, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. Daniel cultivated land while Minsu gathered from the sea. Still, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. She brought fish, seaweed, shells, and bird eggs from distant rocks. In that moment, two different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. Daniel saw Minsu becoming part of the same growing ecosystem. In practice, outside rumors kept moving closer, while their trust developed. He built, she gathered, and both became stronger together. On Bone Needle, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. One evening, Daniel heard Minsu speaking quietly on the northern cliff. In that moment, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. He respected her privacy and returned to the terrace. In practice, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. Later, she explained that the cliff offered an excellent defensive viewpoint on Bone Needle. Shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. It covered 3 directions but left one blind approach from the southwest. For Daniel, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. Daniel asked who she expected to attack. Even then, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. Minsu answered with one word: everyone. Throughout that period, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. Instead of dismissing her fear, Daniel requested a full security survey. At the same time, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. They spent the next week walking every ridge and natural crevice. More importantly, to different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. Daniel saw water flow, soil depth, warmth, and potential cultivation beneath the surface. Outside rumors kept moving closer while their trust developed. Minsu saw firing lines, escape routes, cover, and exposed ground. Still, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. Their perspectives seemed opposite, but improved the same designs. More importantly, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. She redirected trails that offered attackers straight lines of sight beneath the surface. Her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. Daniel stabilized surfaces that would become dangerous during retreat. Still, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. Minsu's body revealed more about her past than her words. In that moment, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. She never sat without checking what stood behind her. In practice, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. Open ground kept one hand near her knife. On Bone Needle, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. Every small sound woke her immediately. For Daniel, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. By the second week, the poison wound had nearly closed. Even then, to different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. Only a rough crimson scar remained beneath her shoulder. Throughout that period, outside rumors kept moving closer while their trust developed. The island moss had accomplished something beyond ordinary medicine. At the same time, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. Several days later, Minsu finally explained why armed men had chased her. Even then, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. She came from the Han clan, hunters serving Loomer as priestly counsel. Throughout that period, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. Her family had tracked smugglers, intruders, and refugees for generations. At the same time, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. 2 years earlier, the council issued an order changing everything. More importantly, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. Refugees from the eastern islands were no longer to be detained beneath the surface. Every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. They were to be executed without trial or investigation. Still, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. Minsu obeyed orders until reaching one fishing village. In that moment, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. 12 civilians waited below her position, including women and children. In practice, to different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. A 5-year-old girl collected shells while Minsu held a drum bow. On Bone Needle, outside rumors kept moving closer while their trust developed. That innocent sight broke the obedience her clan expected. For Daniel, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. Minsu lowered the weapon, abandoned the mission, and walked away. In practice, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. Her own people pursued her across several islands. On Bone Needle, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. A poisoned arrow struck during the 3rd day of pursuit. For Daniel, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. She escaped in a stolen boat before a storm destroyed it. Even then, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. The broken plank eventually carried her toward Bone Needle. Throughout that period, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. Minsu expected judgment after finishing the story. At the same time, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. Daniel offered something completely different. More importantly, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. He described a small hut on the northern cliff, beneath the surface. to different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. Its eastern window would face sunrise across the ocean, still. Outside rumors kept moving closer, while their trust developed. If Minsu wanted it, Daniel would design the structure for her. In that moment, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. She accepted with a quiet nod. Beneath the surface, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. Daniel specified a compact stone home protected from northern wind. Still, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. Its walls required 30 centimeters of basalt for insulation. In that moment, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. A sloped roof would carry rain toward a collection gutter. In practice, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. Moss between stones would seal gaps and preserve warmth. On Bone Needle, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. The window faced east exactly as Daniel promised. For Daniel, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. 3 days of labor produced Bone Needle's first true building. Even then, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. Minsu entered slowly and touched every finished wall. Throughout that period, to different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. A raised sleeping platform and storage niche filled the simple interior. At the same time, outside rumors kept moving closer, while their trust developed. Nothing luxurious occupied the room, yet everything belonged to her. More importantly, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. Minsu admitted that nobody had ever built a home specifically for her. Throughout that period, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. Daniel credited the island, claiming he had only supplied the drawing. At the same time, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. For the first time, the corner of her mouth almost became a smile. More importantly, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. 5 days later, Ren returned with 2 additional schooners. Beneath the surface, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. Dora accompanied him beside a younger captain named Taro. Still, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. Their laughter stopped after Minsu's stare reached them. In that moment, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. Ren accepted her presence without asking intrusive questions. In practice, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. Unfortunately, Ren brought news more dangerous than his new supplies. On Bone Needle, to different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. Rumors about moon salt had spread through major trading houses. For Daniel, outside rumors kept moving closer, while their trust developed. 2 expeditions were already preparing to investigate Bone Needle. Even then, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. Their goal was not simply buying salt. On Bone Needle, Minsu measured trust through actions instead of comforting promises. They wanted to determine whether the island could be controlled or taken. For Daniel, her hunter instincts added protection Daniel could never create alone. Daniel looked across the terraces, homes, paths, and living water. Even then, shared work slowly made silence feel less empty. For the first time, outsiders threatened more than his personal survival. By then, Bone Needle was attracting wounded people as readily as plants. They threatened Minsu's home and everything the island had remembered. At the same time, every new relationship increased Daniel's responsibility for the island. Ren opened the 3rd ship's hold to reveal compost, seeds, boards, tools, and livestock. More importantly, Minsu's past explained why safety remained impossible for her to assume. 3 confused chickens stared back from a wooden cage. Beneath the surface, a personal home carried meaning beyond shelter from weather. Daniel realized help from reliable people could outperform magic. Still, to different forms of expertise were becoming complementary. However, the warning attached to those supplies allowed only 14 days. In that moment, outside rumors kept moving closer, while their trust developed. He had 2 weeks to turn a fragile garden into a settlement. In practice, the settlement's future now involved more than Daniel's survival. Daniel drafted the entire expansion plan beside the fire that same night. Still, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. Minsu listened without interrupting while he listed every urgent objective. In that moment, real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. 3 new terraces would secure vegetables and grain. In practice, each completed structure increased the cost of taking Bone Needle. The Cascade network needed additional basins before more residents arrived. On Bone Needle, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. The chickens required shelter, feed, and protection from ocean wind. For Daniel, Gia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. A second hut would prepare for visitors or future settlers. Even then, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. Paths needed connections between every important structure and defensive viewpoint. Throughout that period, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. Most importantly, Daniel wanted a real orchard. At the same time, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. Wren had brought 3 weak saplings damaged by travel. More importantly, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. To everyone else, they looked nearly dead. Beneath the surface, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. Daniel saw future shade, fruit, roots, and permanent soil stability. At the same time, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. Trees would anchor the ecosystem the way columns supported a roof. More importantly, real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. He searched the southern slope for balanced sunlight, warmth, water, and wind protection. Beneath the surface, each completed structure increased the cost of taking bone needle. A natural clearing between terraces offered exactly those conditions. Still, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. Daniel dug each planting hole, half a meter deep. In that moment, Gia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. He mixed local soil with compost, crushed shells, ash, and fish bones. In practice, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. Every sapling received a separate formula based on its condition. On bone needle, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. Daniel described root depth, spacing, wind direction, and expected growth. For Daniel, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. The system accepted those practical details and strengthened each planning. Even then, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. Yellow leaves turned green within 3 days. Throughout that period, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. Bent trunks straightened while new roots entered the prepared soil. For Daniel, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. Daniel checked them every morning and spoke encouragement aloud. Even then, real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. That confession created an unexpected understanding between them. Throughout that period, each completed structure increased the cost of taking bone needle. Real equipment multiplied Daniel's construction speed immediately. At the same time, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. The third terrace required 2 days instead of 4. More importantly, Gia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. The fourth needed 1.5 days. Beneath the surface, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. By the 5th terrace, Daniel finished similar work within a single day. Still, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. The system was not becoming stronger by itself. In that moment, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. Daniel was becoming more precise in the island's language. In practice, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. Concrete measurements produced faster responses than emotional requests. On bone needle, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. Beautiful meant nothing to the system without defined function. In that moment, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. 30 centimeters of drainage meant everything. In practice, real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. On the 4th day, Daniel constructed a stone and wood chicken coop. On bone needle, each completed structure increased the cost of taking bone needle. The 3 hens inspected it with complete and obvious contempt. For Daniel, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. One pecked the moss, another tested the wall, and the third attacked Daniel's finger. Even then, Gia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. He decided that behavior counted as approval. Throughout that period, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. An egg appeared inside the nest the following morning. At the same time, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. Daniel held it like the most valuable resource bone needle had produced. More importantly, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. Salt created money, but protein protected the body, doing every job. Beneath the surface, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. He boiled the egg and divided it equally with Minsu. Still, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. She accepted without comment and returned the evening with twice as many fish. More importantly, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. On the 6th day, Daniel began building the second hut. beneath the surface. Real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. The new building stood near the southern terraces. Still, each completed structure increased the cost of taking bone needle. It included 2 windows, a stone hearth, storage shelves, and a shared bench. In that moment, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. By the 7th evening, Moss sealed its completed walls. In practice, Jia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. On the 8th day, Minsu called Daniel to the northern lookout. On Bone Needle, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. A distant sail showed the unmistakable silhouette of a warship for Daniel. The island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. The vessel moved across the horizon without approaching directly. Even then, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. Daniel increased his pace anyway because next time could be different. Throughout that period, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. He slept only for hours despite promising Minsu 6. At the same time, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. She responded by tripling his fish portions and preparing bitter herbal drinks. Even then, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. Daniel accepted the silent correction and continued building. Throughout that period, real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. The 6th terrace expanded food capacity across the southern slope. At the same time, each completed structure increased the cost of taking bone needle. New gutters increased irrigation without wasting fresh water. More importantly, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. The breakwater received stronger stones along its most vulnerable edge. Beneath the surface, Jia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. Every trail connected faster routes between the shore and high ground. Still, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. On the 12th day, the warship vanished beyond the horizon. In that moment, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. Relief lasted less than 24 hours. In practice, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. Ren returned alone on the 13th day with a serious expression. On Bone Needle, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. The So Trading House had sent an official delegation toward Bone Needle for Daniel. Every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. Its representative was Jiao, youngest daughter of the house leader. In practice, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. She was talented, ambitious, and openly unwanted by her own family. On Bone Needle, real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. Her brothers expected her mission to fail. For Daniel, each completed structure increased the cost of taking bone needle. Her father had sent her far away to reduce conflict over inheritance. Even then, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. Success on Bone Needle could give Jia independent power throughout that period. Jia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. Failure could erase her future completely. At the same time, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. She knew Moon Salt existed and one unaffiliated man controlled production. More importantly, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. Her initial goal was an exclusive contract benefiting the So family. Beneath the surface, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. Ren warned that refusal might bring pressure from 12 merchant ships. Still, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. 3 of those vessels were equipped for war. In that moment, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. Daniel compared that force with 6 terraces, 3 chickens, and 2 residents. Beneath the surface, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. Direct resistance would be ridiculous still. Real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. He chose to prepare the island instead of rehearsing fear. In that moment, each completed structure increased the cost of taking bone needle. Daniel cleaned every trail and repaired every visible gutter. In practice, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. He trimmed moss around cascades without damaging condensation surfaces. On Bone Needle, Jia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. The terraces were weeded and the young trees received support stakes. For Daniel, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. Minsu checked the lookout routes and guest hut security. Even then, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. Daniel placed a bowl of moon salt inside the guest hut. Throughout that period, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. Fresh moss covered the sleeping platform with clean natural insulation. At the same time, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. The island would present its value honestly without pretending to be grander. More importantly, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. Minsu observed that Daniel prepared like someone expecting battle. Throughout that period, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. He answered that negotiations were battle fought with different weapons. At the same time, real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. 2 days later, a polished schooner appeared through morning mist. More importantly, each completed structure increased the cost of taking bone needle. White sails carried the golden emblem of the So trading house. Beneath the surface, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. About a dozen sailors, guards, and attendants crowded the deck. Still, Jia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. A small woman stood at the bow in layered silk. In that moment, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. Her elaborate clothing looked completely impractical for Bone Needle's rocky shore. In practice, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. Jia entered the rowboat first and never showed hesitation. On Bone Needle, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. One high heel caught inside a basalt crack. At that stage, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. She freed it calmly without allowing embarrassment to reach her face. Even then, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. Daniel immediately understood that fragile appearance did not mean weakness. On Bone Needle, the 14-day deadline forced every idea into immediate action. Jia stopped 3 steps away and introduced herself formally. For Daniel, real tools multiplied Daniel's skill more effectively than empty magic. She surveyed the terraces, cascades, homes, and pots without visible surprise. Even then, each completed structure increased the cost of taking Bone Needle. Only her eyes betrayed interest when moon salt flashed near the water. Throughout that period, Minsu watched every new arrival for concealed danger. Daniel welcomed the delegation and suggested touring before discussing business. At the same time, Jia's ambition connected personal survival with commercial strategy. Jia accepted despite the climb and her impossible shoes. More importantly, negotiation replaced hunger as Daniel's most urgent battlefield. Daniel showed only systems he was comfortable revealing. Beneath the surface, the island's appearance needed to communicate confidence without deception. He explained desalination, irrigation, terracing, and wind protection. Still, new buildings transformed a private garden into a settlement. Jia tasted the water and briefly lost control of her expression. In that moment, Daniel was learning that reliable people multiplied his system. She examined moon salt crystals half a second longer than necessary. In practice, every practical improvement gave him greater leverage. Daniel read each reaction like layers in unfamiliar soil. Still, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. Beneath Jia's mask lived fear of returning home empty-handed. In that moment, Jia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. Beneath that fear lived genuine fascination with Bone Needle's potential. In practice, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. The guest hut finally cracked her composure. On Bone Needle, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. Its clean stone floor, moss bed, ocean window, and salt bowl surprised her. For Daniel, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. Daniel offered rest before beginning negotiations the next morning. Even then, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. Jia had expected pressure from a desperate seller. Throughout that period, Minsu remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. Instead, she met an owner comfortable enough to wait. At the same time, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. That evening, Minsu warned Daniel that Jia was dangerous. More importantly, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. Minsu also admitted the guest hut looked beautiful beneath the surface. Trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. At sunset, Daniel counted water, salt, trees, chickens, Minsu, and one ambitious merchant. At the same time, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. For a supposedly worthless island, his starting position no longer looked terrible. More importantly, Jia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. Morning fog framed the garden where Daniel chose to conduct negotiations. Beneath the surface, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. 3 young trees stood behind him while cascades murmured nearby. Still, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. Jia's guards waited 10 paces away, and Minsu watched from higher ground. In that moment, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. The setting reminded everyone that Daniel controlled both product and territory. In practice, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. Gia opened with a 10-year exclusive moon salt contract on Bone Needle. Minsa remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. The So Trading House would manage logistics, security, and distribution for Daniel. Commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. In return, Daniel could never sell salt to another buyer. Even then, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. The offered price tripled what Ren earned at ordinary ports. Throughout that period, trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. Daniel listened without interrupting or revealing excitement. For Daniel, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. Then he asked what happened when exclusivity became inconvenient. Even then, Gia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. Paper promises meant nothing if taking the island became cheaper than paying. Throughout that period, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. Gia's silence answered more honestly than any polished assurance. At the same time, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. The contract was a beautiful leash attached to military pressure. More importantly, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. Daniel rejected exclusivity and proposed a genuine commercial partnership. Beneath the surface, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. The So House would receive priority purchasing and the best available price. Still, Minsa remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. Bone Needle would retain the right to trade elsewhere. In that moment, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. Gia immediately called those terms unacceptable. In practice, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. Daniel placed fresh water and 3 moon salt crystals before her. On Bone Needle, trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. He invited her to think without pressure and returned to his terrace. In that moment, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. Gia remained because going home empty-handed could destroy her future. In practice, Gia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. She spent the day measuring output, travel cost, labor, and market potential. On Bone Needle, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. That evening, she sat directly on the soil beside Daniel. For Daniel, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. Her silk touched dirt, but she refused to retreat. Even then, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. Gia admitted exclusivity trapped Daniel exactly as he feared. Throughout that period, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. However, returning without it would hand victory to her brothers. At the same time, Minsa remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. Daniel finally saw the real person beneath the merchant's mask. More importantly, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. She was not merely selling her family's power. Beneath the surface, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. She was fighting for the right to build something carrying her name. Still, trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. Daniel offered a different role, master of trade for Bone Needle. More importantly, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. Gia would brand moon salt as a legendary product instead of ordinary cargo. Beneath the surface, Gia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. Her name would appear on every premium package she created. Still, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. Recognition, not money, was the offer that finally reached her. In that moment, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. Gia asked why Daniel trusted her with something so important. In practice, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. He explained that she saw systems, margins, and possibilities instantly. On Bone Needle, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. She calculated production within a tiny error after one day. For Daniel, Minsa remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. No other visitor had understood Bone Needle that quickly. Even then, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. Gia's perfect mask finally disappeared completely. Throughout that period, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. Hunger for recognition replaced fear of failure in her expression. At the same time, trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. She requested one night to prepare a new proposal. Even then, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. Daniel accepted, knowing the alliance had already begun emotionally. Throughout that period, Gia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. By dawn, Gia had written the first agreement that truly belonged to her. At the same time, Recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. Gia's proposal created a separate enterprise instead of surrendering Bone Needle to her family. More importantly, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. The island would produce while Gia managed branding, logistics, and commercial strategy. Beneath the surface, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. Her family could invest without gaining direct control over the land. Still, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. Gia initially offered Daniel 60% of profit and requested 2 years of exclusivity. In that moment, Minsu remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. Daniel changed the split to equal shares and limited exclusivity to 1 year. In practice, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. He also required Gia to visit Bone Needle every month. On Bone Needle, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. Quality depended on island conditions that written reports could never fully explain. For Daniel, trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. Gia questioned the requirement before noticing mud covering her expensive shoes. In practice, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. She accepted and admitted future visits demanded more practical footwear. On Bone Needle, Gia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. Both signed the parchment beside the garden. For Daniel, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. Bone Needle had completed its first international agreement without becoming anyone's colony. Even then, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. Before leaving, Gia smiled genuinely for the first time. Throughout that period, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. She called Daniel the strangest man she had ever met. At the same time, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. He answered that people usually said that before offering him employment. More importantly, Minsu remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. Gia's ship departed, leaving glass vials, ribbons, boxes, and detailed instructions. Beneath the surface, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. Premium crystals needed sorting by size and exact weight. Still, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. One desalination process now supported 3 commercial categories. In that moment, trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. Daniel immediately expanded production for improved cascades. Beneath the surface, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. He tested basin shape, stone type, airflow, and crystallization speed. Still, Gia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. Every new cascade reflected lessons learned from the previous one. In that moment, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. Correct cooling created larger, cleaner crystals. In practice, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. Faster evaporation produced smaller grains for common use. By then, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. Gia's sorting strategy tripled value without demanding more land. For Daniel, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. Minsu helped clean basins and separate crystals with surprising precision. Even then, Minsu remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. A hunter's steady hands proved perfect for delicate commercial work. Throughout that period, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. Bone Needle continued growing while they worked. At the same time, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. Moss covered much of the southern slope. More importantly, trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. 3 seabird species nested near the fresh water. Throughout that period, ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. The one-stead rock now supported an expanding food web. At the same time, Gia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. Daniel climbed the summit and felt the island humming beneath his palm. More importantly, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. 2.5 months had transformed black stone into breathing land. Beneath the surface, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. Then the 3rd month brought a hurricane stronger than the first storm. Still, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. Wind tore moss from rock and drove waves across the breakwater. In that moment, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. Daniel's original alcove flooded during the first night. In practice, Minsu remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. He and Minsu sheltered inside her northern hut for 3 days. On Bone Needle, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. Every impact outside sounded like another structure collapsing. For Daniel, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. Daniel mentally counted terraces, cascades, paths, animals, and trees. Even then, Trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. At dawn on the fourth day, the storm finally released them on Bone Needle. Ownership mattered more than any easy promise of profit. Bone Needle looked like a battlefield. For Daniel, Gia's controlled expression concealed personally dangerous stakes. 3 terraces had suffered major damage. Even then, recognition reached her more deeply than inherited wealth. The lowest 2 lost both soil and foundation. Throughout that period, the partnership preserved trade without sacrificing independence. 2 cascades were completely destroyed, while 3 others were cracked. At the same time, Bone Needle's resources were gaining identity beyond raw material. The breakwater survived but lost its upper row. More importantly, every amendment drew a clearer boundary around control. The chicken coop remained intact, and all 3 hens survived angrily beneath the surface. Minsu remained prepared for diplomacy to fail. Daniel rushed toward the orchard and stopped. Still, commercial success created responsibilities larger than survival. 2 trees remained standing despite bent branches. In that moment, limited production protected the island from its own popularity. The 3rd lay uprooted with its trunk broken near the base. In practice, trust developed because both partners understood the danger of dependence. Daniel knew every branch because he had checked that tree each morning. Still, repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. He knelt beside the cold trunk and allowed grief to reach him. In that moment, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Then Earth's memory gave him a reason to stand. In practice, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. Previously accepted designs returned far faster than original construction. On Bone Needle, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. Trails reappeared within 1 day. For Daniel, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. Damaged cascades recovered during the next 2. Even then, military attention was finally moving toward the island. For terraces became usable by the 3rd day. Throughout that period, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. Minsu worked beside Daniel without waiting for instructions. At the same time, fog, stone, roots, and paths were becoming one defense. She remembered every trail stone after walking past it once. More importantly, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. A tracker who forgot paths rarely survived long. Beneath the surface, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. The lower terraces still required complete rebuilding. At the same time, repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. Their foundations had vanished into the ocean beyond the island's memory. More importantly, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Daniel accepted the loss and rebuilt stronger drainage beneath them. Beneath the surface, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. The dead tree did not become meaningless waste. Still, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. He cut the trunk into shelves for homes. In that moment, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. A different sapling replaced the one the storm had taken. In practice, military attention was finally moving toward the island. Then southern winds carried hundreds of unfamiliar seeds across Bone Needle. On Bone Needle, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. They fell like green snow over damp terraces and moss. For Daniel, fog, stone, roots, and paths were becoming one defense. Within a week, new plants covered disturbed soil. Even then, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. The system helped Daniel sense basic qualities through touch. Throughout that period, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. Some new growth felt clearly edible for Daniel. Repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. Other plants carried medicinal value. Even then, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. A few registered as poisonous and were removed. Throughout that period, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. Ecological succession turned destruction into greater diversity. At the same time, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. Healthy soil recovered because Daniel had built living foundations. More importantly, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. Gia returned after the hurricane wearing practical leather boots. Beneath the surface, military attention was finally moving toward the island. That single change proved the island had already influenced her. Still, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. She carried Bone Needle's first serious payment in silver. In that moment, fog, stone, roots, and paths were becoming one defense. The initial premium moon salt batch sold out within 2 days. In practice, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. Its price reached 6 times Ren's original port value. On Bone Needle, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. Daniel placed the money aside without worshipping it. In that moment, repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. Silver was useful only because it purchased tools, knowledge, livestock, and people in practice. Success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Gia delivered seeds, saplings, soil, rope, cloth, and metal equipment. On Bone Needle, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. She also brought for expensive books on local plants and medicine. For Daniel, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. Daniel handled those books more carefully than the silver. Even then, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. Knowledge remained the resource his system multiplied most effectively. Throughout that period, military attention was finally moving toward the island. Gia spent 3 days measuring every stage of production. At the same time, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. She tracked water volume, crystal size, temperature, and drying time. More importantly, fog, stone, roots, and pots were becoming one defense. Her calculations predicted extraordinary profits within 6 months. Beneath the surface, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. At maximum output, moon salt could become the archipelago's most expensive food product. Still, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. Daniel refused to push the island to maximum capacity. More importantly, repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. Bone Needle was a living system, not a conveyor belt. Beneath the surface, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Overproduction would increase short-term profit while damaging future resilience. Still, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. Gia translated his ecological warning into scarcity strategy. In that moment, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. Limited supply would preserve quality and drive prices higher. In practice, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. Daniel accepted that interpretation because both approaches protected the land. On Bone Needle, military attention was finally moving toward the island. Before departing, Gia requested a permanent residence on Bone Needle. In practice, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. Daniel promised to design a home matching how she worked. Even then, fog, stone, roots, and pots were becoming one defense. Minsu quietly requested a hut farther from Gia's future location. Throughout that period, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. Daniel noticed her ears reddening and chose not to comment. At the same time, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. The 4th month added to young goats to Bone Needle. Even then, repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. They ate moss, weeds, bark, seaweed, and anything left unguarded. Throughout that period, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Daniel's first pen failed during their first day. At the same time, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. His second pen failed during their second. More importantly, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. A 1-meter stone wall only inspired the goats to attempt harder escapes. Beneath the surface, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. Minsu solved the problem with ropes and carefully placed stakes. Still, military attention was finally moving toward the island. Daniel admitted that engineering sometimes overcomplicated simple problems. In that moment, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. The goats produced a small amount of warm, rich milk. In practice, fog, stone, roots, and pots were becoming one defense. After months of fish and greens, it tasted like a feast. On Bone Needle, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. Daniel shared the first mug with Minsu. For Daniel, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. Her approving nod represented the highest praise she normally offered. In practice, repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. Daniel immediately began considering cheese production. On Bone Needle, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Moon salt and goat cheese sounded ridiculous until the business potential became obvious. For Daniel, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. That progress ended when Ren arrived carrying urgent military information. Even then, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. Vulcania had launched a cartographic expedition into neutral waters. Throughout that period, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. 3 ships were moving through the region under scientific cover. At the same time, military attention was finally moving toward the island. Battle mages traveled among the surveyors disguised as ordinary specialists. More importantly, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. Bone needles stood directly along their planned route. Beneath the surface, fog, stone, roots, and paths were becoming one defense. Each vessel could carry several dozen people. Still, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. The island had one landscape architect, one former hunter, and no army. In that moment, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. Minsu began counting attackers before Ren finished speaking. Beneath the surface, repeated recovery was becoming bone needles defining strength. Daniel spent 3 nights studying every possible military response. Still, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Walls could delay one expedition, but invite a larger force. In that moment, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. Weapons might defend the island once while transforming it into permanent battlefield. In practice, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. Daniel refused to sacrifice Bone Needle's identity for temporary intimidation. On Bone Needle, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. He would not build a fortress that happened to contain a garden. For Daniel, military attention was finally moving toward the island. He would build a garden capable of defending itself. Even then, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. The cove became the first target of his new doctrine. Throughout that period, fog, stone, roots, and paths were becoming one defense. Daniel spent hours waist-deep in water measuring hidden depth and currents. At the same time, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. He designed underwater ridges that preserved one narrow safe channel. More importantly, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. Large ships would scrape stone before entering the harbor. Throughout that period, repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. Only smaller rowboats could approach without Daniel's guidance. At the same time, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Ren tested the channel and barely passed through safely. More importantly, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. The first layer reduced an invasion force before anyone reached land. Beneath the surface, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. The second layer used warm basalt and cold seawater to intensify fog. Still, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. Dark stone structures stored daylight heat and released it after sunset. In that moment, military attention was finally moving toward the island. Condensation thickened until approaching ships lost visibility near Bone Needle. At that stage, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. The third layer transformed every trail into loops, forks, and false routes. On Bone Needle, fog, stone, roots, and paths were becoming one defense. Residents would recognize landmarks that strangers could not read. For Daniel, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. Hostile visitors could walk for an hour and return to the shoreline. Even then, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. Minsu tested the pathways and confirmed their effectiveness. On Bone Needle, repeated recovery was becoming Bone Needle's defining strength. Then Daniel discovered a fourth layer beyond ordinary landscape design. For Daniel, success had created ecological responsibilities Daniel could not ignore. Bone Needle sensed the intentions of people walking across it. Even then, the hurricane tested whether living systems could endure real destruction. Friendly visitors found dry stones and shorter paths. Throughout that period, Gia's visits were becoming personal instead of purely contractual. Hostile visitors encountered slippery ground, thick air, and stretched distance. At the same time, livestock introduced comfort alongside completely new problems. Every healthy plant functioned like part of a living security network. More importantly, military attention was finally moving toward the island. The island Daniel protected had learned how to protect him. Beneath the surface, Daniel rejected the ordinary logic of walls and armies. Minsu called it the strangest defense doctrine imaginable. Still, fog, stone, roots, and paths were becoming one defense. Daniel answered that he was not a general. In that moment, the island measured strangers before Daniel needed violence. He was a gardener preparing for war. In practice, every peaceful solution bought preparation rather than permanent safety. Gia returned one day before Volcania reached Bone Needle. Still, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond moonsalt. She carried an official songwood trading license bearing an imperial commercial seal. In that moment, Volcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. Any attack would now threaten one of Songwa's largest trading houses. In practice, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. Gia had secured that protection herself through 3 weeks of negotiations. On Bone Needle, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. Daniel praised her achievement and briefly cracked her professional mask. For Daniel, every new home made surrender less imaginable. At dawn, 3 gray warships emerged from the fog. Even then, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. The lead vessel immediately scraped against Daniel's underwater stone labyrinth. Throughout that period, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. Repeated attempts found more hidden ridges and no safe entrance. At the same time, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. All 3 ships anchored offshore and lowered smaller rowboats. More importantly, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. Fog separated several boats before they could locate the cove. Beneath the surface, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. Only 14 visitors reached land from a force of roughly 80. At the same time, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond moonsalt. Daniel waited unarmed with green terraces rising behind him. More importantly, Volcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. Captain Arnold Crane introduced the landing as a peaceful scientific survey. Beneath the surface, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. His polite words contradicted the soldiers and concealed midge beside him. Still, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. Daniel welcomed inspection under one condition: every weapon remained ashore. In that moment, every new home made surrender less imaginable. Crane resisted, consulted the cloaked midge, and reluctantly accepted. In practice, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. The visitors followed routes Daniel selected through cascades, terraces, and gardens. By then, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. Real cartographers measured everything with growing professional fascination. For Daniel, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. An elderly scholar studied condenser moss and respected Daniel's achievement. Even then, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. The cloaked midge ignored surface wonders and examined the island itself. Throughout that period, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. He pressed one palm against basalt and sensed something ancient below. For Daniel, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond moonsalt. Removing his hood, he introduced himself as Archmage Corvin Wald. Even then, Volcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. Wald requested a private conversation beneath Daniel's young fruit trees. Throughout that period, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. He had studied records describing a drowned continent for 20 years. At the same time, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. Those records identified Bone Needle as its final exposed peak. More importantly, every new home made surrender less imaginable. The system was not merely a gift but a sentinel and lock. Beneath the surface, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. Power beneath the island could reshape the entire surrounding archipelago. Still, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. Daniel understood that his farming cheat guarded something vastly larger. In that moment, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. Wald remained for 2 days while Crane's measurements repeatedly failed. In practice, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. Distances shifted, compasses lied, and simple trails rejected hostile assumptions. On Bone Needle, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. One soldier became lost between the cove and a nearby cascade. In that moment, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond moonsalt. The island forced Volcania to feel unwelcome without injuring anyone. In practice, Volcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. During their final conversation, Wald warned Daniel about ancient danger. On Bone Needle, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. Previous masters had weaponized the same power and drowned their civilization. For Daniel, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. Planting trees looked harmless, but empires would eventually demand the system. Even then, every new home made surrender less imaginable. Daniel admitted he could not control everything sleeping beneath Bone Needle. Throughout that period, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. He only knew how to build, plant, repair, and heal land. At the same time, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. If rulers denied a gardener the right to his garden, they could try taking it. More importantly, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. However, they would need to explain why apple trees deserve destruction beneath the surface. Each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. Wald called Daniel either extremely wise or dangerously naive. Still, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. Daniel answered that those qualities often looked identical from outside. More importantly, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond moon salt. The Archmage departed without threats, capture, or an official ultimatum. Beneath the surface, Volcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. Gray sails disappeared into fog while Minsu and Geo watched silently. Still, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. Everyone understood Volcania had withdrawn only to reconsider the situation. In that moment, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. Daniel refused to waste the temporary peace on celebration. In practice, every new home made surrender less imaginable. He checked cascades, terraces, animals, and water before anything else. On Bone Needle, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. The island remained alive, productive, and completely under local control for Daniel. Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. Wald would return someday, probably with more knowledge and greater pressure. Even then, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. By then, Daniel intended to have more than 2 allies. Throughout that period, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. The next stage of Bone Needle would be built by people needing home. At the same time, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. After Volcania withdrew, Ren began bringing people instead of tools or trade goods. Even then, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond moon salt. The first arrivals were Hiro, Setsu, and their 2 children, Tomo and Lin. Throughout that period, Volcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. Rising seas had swallowed their home and forced them onto a boat. At the same time, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. Hiro proved himself a 4th-generation fisherman who understood currents like Daniel understood soil. More importantly, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. Setsu transformed simple fish, greens, eggs, and goat milk into comforting meals. Beneath the surface, every new home made surrender less imaginable. Tomo and Lin became the first children whose laughter crossed Bone Needle's terraces. Still, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. The island responded to their presence with new springs, thicker vegetation, and flowers. In that moment, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. Lin discovered a clearing of blue blossoms and asked Daniel for red ones. In practice, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. That innocent request showed Daniel why building this home mattered beyond survival. On Bone Needle, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. Jiao returned, found the guest hut occupied, and demanded a permanent residence. For Daniel, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. Daniel designed her home around work, comfort, ocean views, and precise personal measurements. In practice, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond moon salt. A shelf beside her window held moon salt and 3 blue flowers. On Bone Needle, Volcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. Gia's reaction revealed how rarely anyone had created something specifically for her. For Daniel, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. An exiled healer named Gang or Ivenex and organized the island's medicinal plants. Even then, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. His knowledge transformed wild growth into treatments, ointments, and strategic commercial resources. Throughout that period, every new home made surrender less imaginable. Those medicines created another threat because Lumira strictly controlled several valuable species. At the same time, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. Daniel realized every new blessing could attract another empire seeking ownership. More importantly, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. He asked Gia to recruit skilled refugees willing to build and defend a home. Beneath the surface, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. By the 7th month, 23 people lived and worked across Bone Needle. Still, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. They included a blacksmith, weavers, sailors, a carpenter, a potter, an herbalist. In that moment, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. Captain Unipac arrived with disgraced sailors who had refused inhuman orders beneath the surface. Ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond Moonsalt. After surveying Bone Needle, Una declared it a place worth defending. Still, Vulcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. Daniel asked her to design a harbor where sea and land worked together. In that moment, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. Una supplied maritime knowledge while Daniel translated it into stone, wood, and pathways. In practice, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. 23 pairs of hands completed work one man could never finish alone. On Bone Needle, every new home made surrender less imaginable. The settlement gained for docks, a warehouse, stairs, and a sheltered stone pier. For Daniel, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. A lighthouse began burning every evening from the northern cliff. Even then, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. Minsu lit it for anyone lost at sea, remembering her own desperate arrival. Throughout that period, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. Daniel finally understood that the system amplified him, while people multiplied everything. At the same time, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. The 9th month opened beneath scarlet sails carrying 5 priests from Lumira. More importantly, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. Their white robes flashed against the black shore like drawn blades. Throughout that period, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond Moonsalt. Golden symbols marked them as representatives of the priestly council. At the same time, Vulcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. They arrived without soldiers, yet every movement carried the weight of authority. More importantly, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. Their rowboat touched the new harbor Daniel's people had built together. Beneath the surface, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. The chief priest stepped ashore first, tall, thin, and cold-eyed. Still, every new home made surrender less imaginable. His face held the patience of someone accustomed to automatic obedience. In that moment, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. He studied the terraces, cascades, harbor, homes, and gathered residents. In practice, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. Nothing in his expression admitted surprise, although the island demanded it. On Bone Needle, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. Bone Needle had become green where old maps showed only death. For Daniel, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. Fresh water ran across stone that had never supported a spring. Even then, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. Moon salt glittered beside crops, livestock, workshops, and living homes. On Bone Needle, ancient history had expanded the danger far beyond Moonsalt. The priest finally announced that the miracle belonged to Lumira. For Daniel, Vulcania's withdrawal represented reconsideration, not defeat. He claimed every living thing there existed through the goddess's will. Even then, refugees brought skills no system notification could manufacture. Therefore, the priestly council would take custody of the entire island. Throughout that period, the harbor connected lost people with stable land. His declaration treated Daniel's ownership as a temporary clerical error. At the same time, every new home made surrender less imaginable. Daniel stood directly before him with empty, dirt-stained hands. More importantly, collective labor had become visible proof of ownership. Unipac held position beside Daniel near the harbor steps. Beneath the surface, Bone Needle was becoming a society instead of one man's project. 10 veteran sailors formed a steady line behind their captain. Still, religious pressure approached faster than Daniel's population could grow. The island's other residents gathered behind them without being summoned. In that moment, each resident added knowledge the island genuinely needed. 23 people faced the priest as one small, stubborn community. In practice, the settlement now possessed reasons to resist beyond commercial value. No one carried enough force to challenge a temple army. Still, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. Still, nobody stepped backward when the demand reached them. In that moment, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. Daniel answered with the same calm used on impossible construction sites. In practice, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. He thanked the goddess for supposedly noticing their extremely busy island. Throughout that period, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. Then he credited compost, drainage, patience, and relentless human labor. For Daniel, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. The chief priest's eyes sharpened at the deliberate correction. Even then, Each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. Daniel made his position completely clear without raising his voice. Throughout that period, the settlement remained united under public pressure. Bone Needle would not be transferred, leased, surrendered, or spiritually repossessed. At the same time, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. The priest replied that Daniel had misunderstood the situation. More importantly, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. This was not an offer requiring the owner's approval. Beneath the surface, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. According to him, the goddesses had already decided everything. At the same time, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. Daniel glanced toward the fruit trees moving gently in the wind. More importantly, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. Then he delivered the answer nobody expected from a threatened ruler. Beneath the surface, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. The goddess had never provided a schedule for fertilizing those trees. Still, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. If she wanted the island, she should study agronomy first. In that moment, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. Silence crashed across the harbor harder than an incoming wave. In practice, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. Yuna's mouth remained firm, but her eyes carried fierce approval. On Bone Needle, the settlement remained united under public pressure. Minsu watched from higher ground with one hand near her knife. For Daniel, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. Jiao stood beside the salt warehouse, measuring every political consequence. Even then, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. The chief priest did not shout or lose control throughout that period. Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. That restraint made his anger feel colder and more dangerous. For Daniel, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. He ordered his group to inspect the supposed divine property. Even then, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. Daniel did not block them with soldiers or physical barricades. Throughout that period, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. He simply stepped aside and allowed Bone Needle to answer. At the same time, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. The priests entered the first trail leading toward the southern terraces. More importantly, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. One turn brought them toward the western slope instead. Beneath the surface, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. The next fork returned them to the harbor without explanation. Still, the settlement remained united under public pressure. They tried again, choosing a completely different path. In that moment, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. That trail curved through moss and returned them to the same stone. In practice, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. Every route appeared clear until they committed to walking it. On Bone Needle, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. Then distance stretched, landmarks shifted, and familiar turns disappeared. In that moment, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. The priests began marking stones to track their progress. In practice, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. Moments later, those marks appeared behind them instead of ahead. On Bone Needle, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. The air grew thicker around each person carrying hostile intent. For Daniel, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. Dry stones became slick beneath perfectly clean ceremonial shoes. Even then, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. Harmless slopes forced them to slow like exhausted climbers. Throughout that period, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. The island was not attacking, trapping, or injuring anyone. At the same time, the settlement remained united under public pressure. It was simply refusing to guide people who came to own it. More importantly, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. Daniel watched the living defense work exactly as he had hoped. Beneath the surface, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. Every root, flower, moss bed, and water channel sensed intrusion. Still, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. The ecosystem he protected now protected every person calling it home. More importantly, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. One younger priest refused to accept humiliation from ordinary terrain. Beneath the surface, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. He lifted both hands and began chanting a formal prayer. Still, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. Power gathered around him, cold and bright beneath the afternoon sky. In that moment, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. The nearby residents tensed, but Daniel remained completely still. In practice, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. Before the prayer finished, the ground beneath the priest softened. On Bone Needle, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. His polished shoes sank to the ankles in living soil. For Daniel, the settlement remained united under public pressure. The champ broke into a startled breath as balance abandoned him. Even then, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. He pulled one leg free and sank deeper with the other. Throughout that period, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. No weapon touched him, and no fighter made a move. At the same time, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. Bone Needle answered aggression by removing the priest's dignity. Even then, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. The young man stopped chanting and dragged himself onto firm stone. Throughout that period, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. Mud coated the white robes he had protected so carefully. At the same time, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. Even the senior priest could not pretend the message was unclear. More importantly, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. His command worked on followers, officials, and frightened villages. Beneath the surface, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. It did not work on soil that recognized its own caretaker. Still, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. Daniel offered no mockery while the younger man recovered. In that moment, the settlement remained united under public pressure. That calm refusal made the defeat feel even more complete. In practice, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. The delegation regrouped at the shoreline beneath the golden temple symbols. On Bone Needle, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. The chief priest faced Daniel with his perfect mask restored. In practice, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. He warned that Lumero would remember this rejection. In practice, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. Bone Needle would be named a heretical territory before every believer. On Bone Needle, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. No faithful citizen would willingly trade, visit, or settle there. At that stage, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. The threat targeted Daniel's business, reputation, and growing population at once. Even then, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. Jiao immediately understood how much damage such a decree could cause. Throughout that period, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. Yuna understood the danger to shipping routes and future refugees. At the same time, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. Gang understood what religious isolation could mean for medicine. More importantly, the settlement remained united under public pressure. Minsu understood that today's words could become tomorrow's arrows. Beneath the surface, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. Daniel understood every risk, yet his answer stayed almost casual. Still, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. He said losing those visitors would be a genuine shame. In that moment, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. The simplicity of that response stripped power from the threat. Beneath the surface, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. The priest expected fear, bargaining, or at least visible hesitation. Still, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. Instead, Daniel treated divine punishment like disappointing customer feedback. In that moment, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. Behind him, no resident asked him to reconsider. In practice, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. The blacksmith remained beside his tools and unfinished metalwork. On Bone Needle, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. The weavers held their ground near the cloth they had produced. For Daniel, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. The fishermen stayed close to the harbor carrying their own nets. Even then, the settlement remained united under public pressure. The children watched from safety among adults who had chosen this home. Throughout that period, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. Those people had arrived from floods, exile, betrayal, and abandonment. At the same time, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. They knew exactly what losing land felt like. More importantly, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. That history made surrender impossible, even before Daniel answered. Throughout that period, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. The chief priest finally looked beyond Daniel toward the settlement. At the same time, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. He saw workshops, gardens, shelters, livestock, and a functioning port. More importantly, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. More importantly, he saw people who were not waiting to be rescued. Beneath the surface, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. They had already rescued one another by building together. Still, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. The temple could condemn a rock, but Bone Needle was no longer one. In that moment, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. It had food, water, trade, medicine, defenses, and shared purpose. In practice, the settlement remained united under public pressure. The delegation's spiritual claim could not erase those physical facts. On Bone Needle, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. The scarlet ship remained offshore, beautiful and completely useless. For Daniel, the priest had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. Its priests possessed status, doctrine, and a powerful institution. Even then, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. Daniel possessed the ground beneath every step they attempted. On Bone Needle, the delegation's authority weakened whenever the land refused obedience. Their inspection had failed, their prayer had failed, and their demand had failed. For Daniel, every resident remembered what losing home had already cost. Not one terrace changed hands during the entire confrontation. Even then, Daniel refused to confuse politeness with surrender. Not one cascade stopped producing clean water or valuable salt. By then, Bone Needle defended itself without demanding bloodshed. Not one resident abandoned Daniel when the temple applied pressure. At the same time, practical reality kept defeating claims unsupported by labor. The final balance was obvious to everyone standing on the harbor. More importantly, each failed path exposed the weakness behind ceremonial confidence. Lumira could declare whatever it wanted beyond the horizon. Beneath the surface, the settlement remained united under public pressure. Here, the island recognized Daniel and the people who nurtured it. Still, religious status could not erase water, food, homes, or work. The priests still had a ship, but they had no claim. In that moment, the priests had arrived expecting compliance rather than negotiation. Bone Needle had ended the confrontation without drawing a single blade. At that point, Daniel's calm answers made their intimidation increasingly ineffective. The immediate victory did not make Daniel celebrate like a conquering king. Still, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. He first checked the trails for damage caused by the unwanted inspection. In that moment, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. Next came the terraces, water channels, animals, and medicinal plants. In practice, every resident represented a life given another beginning. Everything important remained alive, productive, and safely under local care. On Bone Needle, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. Gia reviewed the political risk while standing beside the salt warehouse. For Daniel, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. Una inspected the cove and confirmed every ship remained outside defensive waters. Even then, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. Gang checked the younger priest footprints for damaged medicinal growth. Throughout that period, disciplined work remained stronger than inherited titles. Hero returned to his fishing traps before the tide shifted. At the same time, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. Setsu resumed preparing food for workers and children across the settlement. More importantly, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. The blacksmith's hammer started ringing again before the tension fully faded. Beneath the surface, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. Life on Bone Needle refused to pause for distant authorities. At the same time, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. Months earlier, the same island had offered nothing but wet basalt. More importantly, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. He had arrived knee-deep in freezing water beneath unfamiliar stars. Beneath the surface, every resident represented a life given another beginning. No food waited, no shelter existed, and no ally knew his name. Still, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. Everyone who knew Bone Needle considered ownership a punishment or joke. In that moment, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. Daniel had received the worst land anyone could possibly inherit. In practice, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. Then one precise design changed the direction of his entire life. On Bone Needle, disciplined work remains stronger than inherited titles. His first cascade transformed poisonously salty water into something sweet for Daniel. The once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. By sunrise, living moss had multiplied the system's efficiency. Even then, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. Rare moon salt had crystallized as a profitable secondary reward. Throughout that period, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. That first day did not magically construct a finished empire. For Daniel, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. It proved that Daniel possessed the method capable of building one. Even then, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. His system rewarded knowledge, measurements, labor, and respect for the land. Throughout that period, every resident represented a life given another beginning. It never replaced his hands, courage, judgment, or exhausting personal effort. At the same time, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. Every impossible improvement still began with Daniel understanding a real problem. More importantly, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. He designed drainage because crops could not survive on flooded soil. Beneath the surface, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. He created terraces because seeds could not root inside hard basalt. Still, disciplined work remains stronger than inherited titles. He built breakwaters because clean water meant nothing after storm destruction. In that moment, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. He planted trees because temporary gardens needed permanent ecological anchors. In practice, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. He shaped fog and winding paths because walls would invite bigger armies. On Bone Needle, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. Each answer solved one crisis while strengthening the entire living system. In that moment, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. That pattern turned survival into stability, and stability into prosperity. In practice, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. Moon salt brought silver, but silver alone never made Bone Needle rich. On Bone Needle, every resident represented a life given another beginning. Fresh water made the island valuable to every desperate ship. In practice, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. Healthy soil created food where maps promised only starvation. Even then, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. Medicinal plants gave exiles and refugees another reason to survive. Throughout that period, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. Goats, chickens, fish, and crops turned meals into dependable security. At the same time, disciplined work remained stronger than inherited titles. The harbor transformed isolation into controlled connection with the wider world. More importantly, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. Workshops allowed skilled people to rebuild careers taken from them elsewhere. Beneath the surface, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. Children's laughter proved the island offered more than profitable resources. Still, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. For Daniel, that sound became a measurement no instrument could calculate. More importantly, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. Minsu brought the instincts of a hunter who expected danger everywhere. Beneath the surface, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. Her knowledge turned exposed paths into roots built for survival. Still, every resident represented a life given another beginning. She also lit the lighthouse because darkness had once nearly killed her. In that moment, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. That flame promised every lost traveler that land still existed ahead. In practice, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. Jia out-transformed unrefined salt into a legendary premium product. On Bone Needle, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. Her calculations multiplied value without forcing the island past healthy limits. For Daniel, disciplined work remains stronger than inherited titles. She gained something greater than profit by placing her name on success. Even then, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. Hero organized the sea with the same discipline Daniel brought to land. Throughout that period, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. Setsu turned limited ingredients into meals that restored exhausted people. At the same time, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. Gang gave medicinal plants names, uses, dosages, and real healing purpose. Even then, The contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. Unit connected stone and ocean through a harbor designed around return. Throughout that period, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. Every resident added a skill the system could never create alone. At the same time, every resident represented a life given another beginning. Daniel finally understood the true formula behind his expanding territory. More importantly, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. The system amplified one builder, but a community multiplied every possibility. Beneath the surface, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. One person could carve a garden from a dead volcanic spike. Still, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. 23 committed people could begin constructing an entirely new society. In that moment, disciplined work remained stronger than inherited titles. It needed fair work, shared protection, useful knowledge, and trusted relationships. In practice, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. He offered people land that would answer their honest effort. At that stage, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. In return, they protected it because losing home was no longer acceptable for Daniel. The richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. That bond made Bone Needle stronger than its rarest commercial resource. In practice, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. For empires could measure salt production, harbor depth, and military value. On Bone Needle, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. None of them could easily calculate what belonging was worth. For Daniel, every resident represented a life given another beginning. The island's wealth existed in water, food, medicine, trade, and loyalty. Even then, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. It also existed in every repaired path after another violent storm. Throughout that period, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. Earth's memory preserved what Daniel created and accelerated its restoration. At the same time, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. Human memory preserved why those structures deserved protection in the first place. More importantly, disciplined work remained stronger than inherited titles. Together, those two forces made destruction increasingly difficult and expensive. Beneath the surface, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. That was why warships could not simply erase Daniel's work overnight. Still, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. Even when storms broke terraces, the island remembered their exact design. In that moment, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. Even when outsiders threatened residents, the community remembered previous abandonment. Beneath the surface, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. Both the land and its people had learned how to recover. Still, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. Recovery became Bone Needle's most dangerous and valuable hidden power. In that moment, every resident represented a life given another beginning. Daniel stood again on the central height and surveyed the result. By then, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. Green terraces stepped down slopes once polished black by lifeless wind. On Bone Needle, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. Water moved through cascades that seemed impossible on an ocean rock. For Daniel, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. Smoke rose from homes built for individuals rather than anonymous settlers. Even then, disciplined work remained stronger than inherited titles. The harbor lights reflected across waves that once separated him from everything. Throughout that period, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. Blue flowers moved near pots where children now ran without fear. At the same time, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. Beyond them, moons salt-dried in carefully managed production basins. More importantly, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. Every visible detail began as a problem someone else considered unsolvable. Throughout that period, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. Daniel had answered those problems with plans precise enough for stone. At the same time, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. He had also answered lonely people with space precise enough for belonging. More importantly, every resident represented a life given another beginning. The second achievement meant more than the first, although both created wealth. Beneath the surface, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. His greatest empire was not measured by territory covering a map still. The island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. It was measured by how many ruined lives could begin again there. In that moment, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. That made the island richer than kingdoms wasting fortunes on conquest. In practice, disciplined work remained stronger than inherited titles. Daniel did not need to call himself emperor for that truth to exist. On Bone Needle, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. He remained the landscape architect who checked soil before checking silver. For Daniel, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. He still noticed blocked gutters before political insults or ceremonial threats. Even then, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone. That ordinary discipline kept extraordinary power from turning him into a tyrant. On Bone Needle, the contrast with Daniel's arrival had become impossible to ignore. The system had chosen someone capable of creating instead of consuming. For Daniel, wealth now included safety, dignity, knowledge, and belonging. Bone Needle responded because Daniel never treated it like disposable property. Even then, every resident represented a life given another beginning. He treated stone, water, plants, animals, and people as connected systems. Throughout that period, Daniel measured success through systems capable of enduring loss. In return, the island gave every element another chance to thrive. At the same time, the island's recovery mirrored the people who lived there. The rock everyone laughed at had become neutral ground nobody could ignore. More importantly, community gave every rare resource deeper meaning. Its first profitable miracle appeared after one day of intelligent design. Beneath the surface, disciplined work remained stronger than inherited titles. Its lasting power came from months of labor shared by a chosen family. Still, the once empty horizon no longer defined Daniel's world. That was how Daniel turned the world's worst island into its richest home. In that moment, Bone Needle's true power was its ability to recover. And Bone Needle stood alive, independent, and completely worth defending. In practice, the richest empire began as one correct design on dead stone.